To catch you all up, we're in person here every Tuesday, Thursday, mostly because groups and social work in general is in person. I do Zoom out like this, do the live stream so that folks can get access. I would like, if you lead a group, that you either do it through a Zoom link or that you also um, went ahead and used your incomplete to lead the group in person in the fall at centralstate.edu. So I was going to observed a group yet, or turn in your write-up yet, just so you can see and launch this dialogue and then go from there. So I hope to see you all on Zoom in the next 2 weeks leading your group, or take the incomplete and lead it in the fall. So in that case, I am ready to get live on this. If the meeting is still going on. And if not, I did have one of the live meetings that will get us over to Dr.
Do something that's regrettable.
Let's say I'm working on a research paper about the future of renewable energy, and I come across a study with findings I want to...
Skills to talk things out, to engage in problem-solving behavior, to engage in self-talk, because sometimes you might be dealing with another person who's equally dysregulated, but they have reckless abandonment. So you might have to talk yourself down, not to do something that's regrettable. So teaching these skills could be useful. So shifting towards college counseling centers is another school-based setting. Again, it's time limited, many times lasting only up to 16 weeks. And you might be like, well, why 16 weeks? Because most semesters are about 15 to 16 weeks. They tend to focus on educational development, tend to deal with school mastery and passing one's classes. And I know we have a counseling center. We ran these groups for people. We also could have career planning groups. What's ironic is that I'm talking to you about this, and sure enough, these were some themes we discussed in our group, such as stress about what comes next. I think Brenda said that, right? So career planning and the anxiety that comes with school and stress management and grief groups, all of these are important. Now, it's interesting, by the time you're in college, you probably have dealt with a loss. If it's a grandparent, that's the most common. If it's a parent, that's also somewhat common. So you can run grief groups to help deal with grief and loss. COVID has created a whole host of grief groups on university levels, cultural identity groups. So, St. Francis College and the CUNY system, they're really, really good because there's tremendous diversity. So helping us appreciate individual differences and celebrate those differences are important. Non-traditional age groups. So St. Francis College also, we have first generation college students, and there's no expiration date on education. So we have a larger number of non-traditional age students. So what if you're an older student and you're around a bunch of people 18 to 22, you might feel out of place. So having a group to help non-traditional college students cope could be useful. And as always, self-esteem groups, right? That's tremendous in middle school, high school, and college. These are very common. All right. Now, what are the key points? So if you're going to design a group in a school, make sure you get administrator support. I think I've said this before. Do not go rogue because you're leaving yourself at risk. If your administrator doesn't support your group, don't run it, no matter how well-intentioned it is. You want to communicate with students and children about the importance of keeping confidence. Now, if you're in the same class with someone and people share very vulnerable aspects of their life, you don't want people going around talking about that. You want to keep the privacy. So what happens in group stays in group, and you want to say it in a way that they understand, right? And you might even talk, especially because there's a level of egocentrism at this age. You want to talk about, you wouldn't want someone talking about you, right? So we want to keep everything private or confidential. Now, don't just throw every kid who has a learning problem, self-esteem issues, or being bullying into a group. Not every child is ready for group participation. And even if they are ready for the group, they may not share as much. Involve parents in the group work with the children. That isn't to say you share with the parents what they say in the group, but if there are exercises that are meant to be done between groups, you might link the parents in to ensure that they get done. And then role playing is quite useful, especially when it comes to peer pressure and whatnot. And that, my friends, is today's lesson. Any questions on that?
Press 1. If you're told to make a statement.
Okay. One thing I didn't say in the lesson is also you want to make sure that kids don't feel like you're talking down to them. And I'm using the word kids, which in of itself might be a bias. But if you're working with children, adolescents, you don't want to be like, oh, what do you know? You're just a teenager or things like that. You want to make sure that you don't engage in ageism. I know that when you think of ageism, you might think middle adulthood or late adulthood, but there is a form of ageism called adultism, where you believe that if you're not an adult, you know nothing. You're meant to be seen and not heard. But children, adolescents, they have ideas, they have wisdom. And it's your job to celebrate their wisdom and not negate their experience. So with that, I'm going to stop. Does anyone have any questions before we conclude today's session?
Enter a prompt here. Okay, it can't be that hard. How about generate an image of a cat playing?
If you would like us to call you back without losing your place in line, press 1. Otherwise, continue to hold.
All right, so you see the complexities of group counseling. Here's the basics. I wanted to finish with that.
Contracts, you will collaboratively develop rules that the group is going to follow as a whole, but there's limited consequence if someone violates the rules. Right now, if someone violates the rules of one of my groups, I require them to bring it back to the group and talk about it with the group. And then the group decides how they want to handle it in a compassionate way. But other than the most extreme scenario where you kick that person out of the group, what else can you do to that person? So confidentiality is a little bit more difficult to maintain. It's also harder to build trust and safety. When you're in a room with one another, it's natural to create a social comparison and start to observe the other person and mistrust the other person, or to think that, to look at them in potentially negative ways and be suspicious of them. So they have to earn your trust, and the more people that need to earn your trust is going to take longer for you to feel safe. And what we will see is that in early stages of group therapy, individuals are oftentimes very superficial in what they talk about, because they're not yet feeling safe. When a person starts to feel safe in a group, that's when they start to take risks. That's when they start to share more things about themselves. Now, group leaders, another disadvantage is, what do you do when the group leader is not properly trained? Well, a group leader who's not properly trained runs the risk of opening up a wound but not knowing how to bandage it and put it back together. So there are risks when group leaders are not properly trained or not properly under supervision. Or another disadvantage is that you may not have enough time to deal with each person thoroughly. So you can do what's called making the rounds, so to speak, where you do a check-in with everybody, but that takes time and you can't do a deep dive. Or if you choose to do a deep dive, the deep dive that you do, or putting the person in the hot seat, so to speak, they're going to get a lot of attention, sometimes unwelcomed attention, and other people are not going to get sufficient attention. So you may not have enough time to deal with each person thoroughly. So other disadvantages of groups is group leaders have less control than in individual therapy. The more people that are in a room, the more you have to yield trust in others. So there are issues with peer pressure, conformity, where people might agree with one another based on some energy in the room, the treatment room. We also could scapegoat. We could make one person the identified patient, and then everyone puts a spotlight on that individual and targets that individual or blames that individual. So scapegoating can occur. We also know that if you don't properly screen an individual and you let someone into your group that really shouldn't have been in the group, they can cause more harm than good. In individual therapy, it's contained, and casualties are more likely to occur, unintended slights, because of the lack of control or the reduced control. So who's involved in group therapy? So who benefits? Well, I guess the question should have been, who's involved in therapy and who's not involved in therapy, right? Group therapy. So who benefits from it? Well, it depends on the group. And I'm going to tell you that almost anyone can benefit from group therapy. So there are very few people that you're going to say, well, you can't benefit from group therapy. But what we tend to see is that the people who benefit the most in group therapy are those who are struggling in relationships. They tend to benefit. And you form a group starting with exclusion criteria. Well, who are you not going to include in the group? Now, that exclusion criteria for one group might be the inclusion criteria for another group. So if we were talking about a support group for individuals, survivors of domestic violence, they might be in one group where you would exclude perpetrators, but you might also have another group that's exclusively for perpetrators. So just because you're excluding one, it means that you're protecting the group experience by separating them out or not including them in a given group. So what are some possible reasons why you might exclude an individual? Well, the person might have a situational crisis that's going to resolve itself. The person might be suicidal. If a person is suicidal, they might need more intensive care or a higher level of care than group therapy could provide. Individuals who cannot commit to coming to group therapy consistently. Now, if a person is late to a group once, no big deal. But if a person is regularly late to a group or is inconsistent in a group, it is your job as a group leader to explore what that might be about. And the natural tendency of clinicians is to assume that that's resistance, that the client does not want to be there. But be careful with that. If you don't explore it, you don't provide the opportunity for that individual to disprove that notion. So I've had the experience where an individual was late to my group therapy and several times, and I said, "Hey, I noticed you were late last Wednesday and the Wednesday before that and the one before that. What do you think that's about?" And the person said, "Oh yeah, my car is in the shop. I have to take mass transportation and it's unreliable." Well, that's new information to me, right? So now that I called attention to that, I was able to understand that it wasn't that they didn't want to show up, it was that there were structural issues that got in the way, such as transportation. But if a person cannot attend regularly, they're not going to benefit as much from group therapy. And then an individual who has antisocial personality disorder is not likely to benefit from most groups unless they're in a group for addressing antisocial personality disorder. An antisocial personality disorder is not that the person is shy, it's antisocial norms. So they violate the basic rules of society, basic human rights, they denigrate. So that would be antisocial personality disorder. They might engage in criminal behavior, bullying or whatnot. So they're not going to benefit as much from most groups unless they're in addressing that issue. Another thing you want to think about is whether you want heterogeneous groups or homogeneous groups. A heterogeneous composition is that you're strategically picking individuals that are different from one another, almost to counterbalance one another. Now, the challenge with heterogeneous groups is that group cohesion can be impacted by that. The more homogeneous the group, the more likely they're going to build group cohesion and bond. So it's something you have to think about, who you admit into your group and the group composition, because as I said earlier in this lesson, if you don't choose wisely, you can have problems at a later point. Now, a group serves as a container. It's very important to set ground rules. The first session I have, and some people refer to this as a pre-meeting. I actually do it not as a pre-meeting, but as the first meeting where everyone's feeding off of one another, working on a common goal. I think it builds morale. But you establish the ground rules. And the ground rules, it's not that I establish the ground rules and as the clinician, these are the rules and you have to follow it. It's that we as a group are going to brainstorm together. What rules do we want for our group? And the group decides whether that is a reasonable rule. For example, the group has to decide whether they want profanity in their group. Personally, I am not bothered by profanity. If a person wants to speak raw, I don't regulate it. But if I were doing a group for where the whole group was highly devout that might be unsettling to hear profanity. What's the rules about eating in group? What are the rules about drinking in group? Or what are the rules about punctuality or use of one's cell phone? Each of these, there are common rules that I'm bringing up, but the group has to decide. And then, you have the norms of the group, the expectations of the group, and the group leader serves as a facilitator. I like the word facilitator because it's providing the members of the group with the greatest responsibility for their growth. And the group leader facilitates the growth, but you choose the growth. Another very important thing about groups is that we focus on the here and now. It's often present to future focus versus individual therapy, depending on your theoretical orientation. It might also be a focus on early childhood experience. So you have to think about how you're going to select participants. So you have to have some kind of screening procedure, inclusion, exclusion criteria for those people who are not suited for group work. And you have to decide, well, how big of a group do you want? And the size can vary depending on the kind of group it is. It could be as small as 3 to 4 group, or it could be several hundreds, depending on whether we're dealing with a psychotherapeutic or a task group or something else. What I will tell you is most group therapy, there's a magical number of about 8. Now, some books say it's best 6 to 8. I will tell you it's fine even if you go as high as 12 members. So group size matters because the smaller the group, the more there's an issue of a person feeling like they're in the hot seat. The larger the group, the more there's an issue of a person feeling like they're getting lost in the group and not getting enough attention. So there is a sweet spot where you want to be. So if you have 8 members in a group, each person eventually is going to have the spotlight on them. And each person eventually is going to not have the spotlight on them. But it's also important to understand the role of the members of the group. Just because a person is not speaking does not mean that they're not actively involved in your group. They might be processing, they might be thinking, they might be deciding whether to take a risk and share. But the larger the group is, the more people get lost in the group dynamic. Another consideration when doing group work is how long your session is going to be. So in individual therapy, a standard session is 45 minutes, 50 minutes, whereas group therapy can range, right? So the magical number that people say is 90 minutes is a good one, especially depending on certain insurance companies. They require it to be 90 minutes. But group therapy, the length of the session could be as little as an hour or as much as 2 hours, depending on what you're doing. And you also need to think about how many sessions you're going to have. Sometimes the therapy is a one-off situation, such as a critical incident debriefing group, or it could be lasting many years when you have open-ended therapy. Now, an open-ended group, and I might say this later, an open-ended group means that the focus of the group is flexible. The length of the group is flexible. People can be admitted to the group at any point, and people can leave the group at any point. So that's an open-ended therapy group. Very flexible, but what's interesting about open-ended groups is that when you insert a new person to the group, it changes the complexion of the group. When someone leaves the group, it changes the complexion of the group. The best example of the challenges you face with open-ended groups is when you're working in inpatient psychiatric hospitals. Because a person might be engaging in group therapy and then they might be released from the hospital and then they disappear from the group. So there is a finesse about how to partially terminate while continuing the group. A finesse about making sure that the members of the group have the ability to say goodbye to another member who might not be there. And one of the rules that I have is outside of an inpatient setting is that if a person is going to leave group therapy, let the group know and provide 2 to 3 sessions notice so that people can grieve your loss. Right now, you're not dead, but you're not part of the group anymore, so there is going to be a loss there. So that's open-ended groups that go on for years. Now, closed-ended groups, you start with a certain number of people, and once that group starts, you do not admit anyone else. So the people you start with are the people you finish with. It's a set amount of time with a set amount of people with a clear focus. So you have to think about that. Now, we talked about the group structure, whether it's open and closed. You also need to think about the ethics of groups. So as I said earlier, one of the rules for a group leader is that we're responsible for your confidentiality. So running groups ethically, it's important to discuss what happens when a person talks about what happens in the group outside of the group, breaking the group confidence. Again, this can happen in many forms. It can happen in subgrouping where 2 or 3 people after the group get together and talk about what happened. That's problematic. Or it could be that a person talked about what happened in a group with another member who's not part of the group. There are rules to that on how to govern that. And what I ask members of the group to do is to self-indict. What do I mean by that? I ask members of the group to share. If they breach the confidence of the group and talk about what happened in group outside of the group experience, I ask them to bring it back to the group members and tell the group that that's what they did. Not as a measure of punishment, but it's a measure of ownership and responsibility. And then you also have to have group evaluation, which is to determine whether the group goals were obtained. So outcomes measures. And outcomes measures can be very challenging at times to assess. So it's good before you develop a group to think about how you're going to measure the effectiveness of your group. And, you know, in the group therapy class, there is an exercise to develop one's own group. And we asked students to create a proposal of a group. And one of the criterion of that assignment, grading factors, is how they're going to measure the effectiveness of the group. All right. Now, group development, it tends to occur in stages. There are some people who talk about 4 stages of group process. There are some people who talk about 5 stages of group process. I'm going to introduce 5 stages, and then I'm going to go with a 4-stage model in general. So, but what we do is we do see that group therapy occurs in a stage-like orderly fashion. Now, just because the group moves in these stages does not mean that each individual moves at the same pace. So if you look at the picture above, there are ladders. Some people are higher along and might move further along in the group process relative to the general group. But in the end, we all get to the same or similar places. Or in a non-functional group, which I'll talk to you about in another lecture, it's possible that you get stuck and never make it to the working stage or of group. But all right, So things have to occur in each stage for you to be transformed and move to the next, right? So let's continue. Another very important thing to know is the concept of group process versus group techniques. When you hear group process, you might hear this referred to as group dynamics. This is how the group behaves with one another. It's how the group naturally unfolds and how one interacts with. So things like building trust or conflict or resistance or interpersonal feedback. That is unique to each group. And I say this every time I teach this class, something unique happens. No two groups are the same. Whereas group techniques are the specific skills or the intervention used to help people grow within the group. So things like role play or homework or challenging a person's beliefs, right? Their worldview, all of these are group skills or micro skills. So here is the 5-stage model. Stage 1 is orientation and forming. This is the beginning stage of group where people are just getting acclimated with one another. Stage 2 is referred to as the transition stage or storming stage. This is where people are starting to take risks, starting to feel vulnerable within the group, starting to put their toe in the water. Stage 3 is the norming stage or group cohesion stage. Now, all of a sudden, you start to see an alliance between the members of the groups. And that brings us to the working or performing stage where everyone is working towards their goal. And then the last stage or stage 5 is adjourning or terminating. And that's when we say goodbye. Stage 1 and stage 5, according to this model, they are structured. I say give yourself 2 to 3 weeks for each of those because it's going to take time to build trust or orient oneself to the group. It's also going to take time to cope with saying goodbye. That's difficult. And I have a lesson on all of these. Now, what's interesting is that stage 3 is omitted by some because the group cohesion is a gradual process that bridges transition and working stages of a group. So if you see later that I don't talk about a group cohesion stage, it's because the concepts have been wrapped in both the transition and working stages of group. Not that I don't know it exists according to some theories, it's just that it's been embedded in the lecture in a different way. So in stage 1, members lean on the group leader for guidance. The rules and norms are discussed. Remember I said in session 1, you should establish the rules. Members tend to be very guarded. They try and figure out the rules. People come in with hidden agendas. And they model communication between the group leader and the group as a whole. Now, shifting from the beginning stages to the forming or the forming stages, people are ready to move to the next stage. Shifting from that stage, when they understand the ground rules, when they develop a sense of trust, feel safe, and demonstrate respect. In stage 2, this is when conflict occurs. And remember what I said earlier in the lesson, with conflict comes intimacy. So members begin to test the group, or they try and seek power, or they try and take risks. And other members may support you or talk about interpersonal conflict. They may block you. So we start to see this conflict, and conflict is okay. That's fine, but the group leader is responsible for making sure that you don't cross the line. Because when you give constructive criticism or negative feedback, it should be done with compassion. So conflict occurs. Members are putting their toe in the water, as I said. They're very tentative. They're trying things out. The group leader, if they're doing what they're supposed to, they should be modeling self-disclosure. Every group that I'm part of, I view myself as a member of the group. Even though I'm your professor, if I'm part of the group, I'm also sharing. And for that hour to hour and a half, I'm with you as an equal. No one calls me Dr. Kaplan. Everybody can call me by my first name. So I'm modeling that safety or equality that is useful. Group leaders are responsible for creating genuine conversations or authenticity, right? So these are all things. So now moving from the second stage to the third stage, you're moving when members start to feel bonded to one another. Risk-taking behavior has increased. Showing care-taking behavior towards one another. That's the transition stage. Then we have group cohesion. Now people know what is expected and they act accordingly. They act responsibly and sensitively to one another. They have an attachment to one another. In the stage 4, and notice how this is just naturally shifting. The group leader is less active and the members become more active. So all of a sudden, those awkward pauses that are healthy and normal in the beginning of group therapy occur fewer and farther between them. Now, the group leader in the working stage starts to model appropriate ways to confront others. So it's important for the group leader to challenge the group members, but in a sensitive way, because when you do that, then the rest of the group is going to do the same thing. Members make commitment to change or act on whatever that commitment is, so that if there's something that comes out of the group experience, a nugget, that person should make a commitment to follow through. And a nice place to begin the next session, and it's called linking, is to say, last week we talked about X, person Y agreed to do this, that, or another. Where are we with that? So you go back and summarize the things that happened in the previous group. And then termination, disengagement requires a few sessions. So saying goodbye is hard. So we don't just say goodbye in one session. We require a couple sessions to do this. We start to see, because we're starting to say goodbye, we're creating distance between ourselves and other people. So risk-taking behavior tapers off because there's not enough time to process that. People start to experience grief and loss. It's very important to understand grief and loss isn't just for a loss of a loved one. It could be a loss of a group member feeling sad that this isn't going to continue. People can have ambivalence towards the group ending. And then if the group was successful, you do a taking stock exercise at the end where there's 360 feedback. I saw this positive growth in you. What I would love to see in the future is X, Y, Z. And if there are people who need continued therapy, you might make referrals as necessary. All right. The point is, when we talk about the development over time, the group leader becomes less the focus, and then eventually the members become the focus. Self-disclosure goes from superficial and personal events to unique experiences one's having. Conflicts are start off with resistance to them, but then you embrace them. Boundaries become more flexible. Differences in values are celebrated. This is what should happen in a healthy group. So, what's the purpose of therapist intervention? Well, it is our job to build trust and safety, to engage in blocking, where you cut off any hostility or abuse that someone engages in, to enforce the rules and norm. If something is going off, to redirect the focus, to offer feedback, and to elicit feedback from others, and to link the experience of one person to another. Sometimes there's a phrase that we use in group therapy, can anyone join them? When we use that phrase, can anyone join them? That means that you're connecting the experience of one member with another so that they don't feel alone or isolated. So we make connections between members. And effective group leaders have very focused or specific group characteristics. They have courage. They have courage of their conviction. They're willing to say something if it's wrong. They have compassion. They understand their own cultural value system. They have stamina, right? So the group can go on, and one could easily get fatigued, but they have stamina persists. They're present. They don't check out and let the group do its own thing. They're open to new experience. They yield personal power. So these are the personal characteristics that they have. So how do we develop group leadership skills? Practice, practice, practice. So your group leadership skills are going to depend on your personality. For me, I try to use humor in my groups to reduce tension among members. Some people, their personality is to be very focused and serious all the time. But I think humor is a nice way it's a leadership skill that I've acquired to help my members. Okay, but the biggest way to develop your group leadership skills is supervision, practice, and feedback. That's going to help you. So some of the skills that you need is clarifying. So clarifying is when you probe for more information if you don't feel like you understood the person. I'm not really sure I understood that clearly, right? And then you repeat back what they said, and you ask for more information. Linking could be linking sessions or linking ideas. Suggesting is offering feedback. Interpreting is not just parroting back what they said, but interpreting the meaning of a given outcome. Facilitating, so guiding or scaffolding another person's growth. Modeling, the group leader should be showing the members how to behave. Blocking, remember how we are responsible for cutting off hostile or aggressive activities. Summarizing, summarization should happen at multiple points in the session. But at a minimum, it's important to summarize at the end of the session the main points that occurred, so that at the end, people feel like they know what happened in the session. And terminating, teaching people how to say goodbye. The next thing I want to talk to you about is culture and multicultural perspectives. It's so important to understand the value of culture and how culture influences the group leader, you, or a group participant, anyone else in your group. So if you are colorblind or culture blind, you are going to trample on people's value system. I am not colorblind. I look in the mirror and I see color, and so do you. So why in a group process do we ignore racial or ethnic experiences, and why do we try and treat a one-size-fits-all experience? Ethnic minorities have a different experience in the world. I don't walk down the street worrying about being profiled by a police officer. It's just not my experience. I don't walk down the street worrying about being whistled at. I wear a yarmulke, so I do worry about anti-Semitism. So you see, when you think about this, our identities affect who we are and experiences we have. So to ignore diversity is actually fairly foolish. So it's important to understand both similarities and differences that are going to occur within the group and celebrate both the similarities and the differences. So diversity competence is important. So that's a sense of understanding of one's own culture. And being culturally competent requires you to be aware of your biases, your stereotypes, your prejudices. Everybody has biases. Not one person in this room doesn't have a bias, for example, or a prejudice. If you have a favorite sports team, then you give preferential attitudes towards that sports team and more negative attitudes towards every other sports team. We all have biases. It's okay to say that we have biases, but we need to know what they are, because if we're not present, they could affect how we interact with others. Know about other people's worldviews and be willing to have a dialogue about similarities and differences. And to be an ethical psychologist or counselor requires you to be competent. Now, I want to introduce you to another word other than cultural competence or diversity competence. I also want to introduce you to cultural humility. Cultural humility moves from the mind to the hearts and emotion, where you're showing more empathy and understanding for another group rather than just intellectually knowing what's right. It's very easy to parrot facts about a group or community, but can you join that group with their suffering? And if you don't know enough about that group, can you admit that you don't know enough and use more knowledgeable members of that group to teach you about their values? That's cultural humility. The other video I have a whole video on developing cultural competence and cultural humility, and I have exercises in it. So hopefully you'll see that. Now, so when you're leading groups or you're a member of a group, it's very important to think of the adverse environmental factors that people experience, how their values influence both being a member of the group or facilitating a group, the role of family and community within that person's culture. It's interesting when you think about family, if you take a US-centric view, we talk about the nuclear family, which is oftentimes the parents and the immediate children. But when we think from collectivist worldview or traditional cultures, their definition of family is more broad and includes multi-generational households, and many times the community, and the community matters. So take that into consideration. Religion and spirituality play a role. Ethnicity plays a role. Now, here are some best practices, right? So this is the American Society of Group Work. They said professional competence in group work is not a final product, but is a continuous process. And I love that, because I've seen people say, I'm culturally competent. I worry about the people who say they are culturally competent, because culture is always changing. It's always in flux. So that which is the prominent worldview of a society today might not be the prominent worldview in 10, 20, or 50 years. So you can't have a fixed mindset and say, oh, well, I learned about that culture. Cultures evolve, people evolve. So you want to have a continuous process of learning, right? So for me personally, I don't say I'm culturally competent. I say I strive towards cultural competence. And the more knowledgeable I am about a group, the more I realize how little I knew prior and how much more I need to learn as we go forward. So try to seek consultation and supervision for guidance, because your own biases could interfere with your ability to function appropriately and facilitate a group. Now, so we talk about all kinds of recommendations that reflect competence. Competence is capability. We have knowledge competency, that's a coursework. Skills competency are those micro skills that we talked about earlier, and core specialization in group, that running different kinds of groups. You could have different competence area. I have to tell you, I have not run every type of group there is. I've run a psychoeducation group. I've run an arts group. I run a substance use group. I run several different groups, but I haven't run all of the kinds of groups, nor do I feel competent to run all the different kinds of groups. But so they talked about what is considered competence. So now the practical side. So forming a group, whenever you write a proposal, you want to have a rationale. What is the rationale for this group? What is the need? Is there really a need for this group? You have to justify the problem and the need. The objectives. Well, what are you going to address in this group? Are they specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and testable, right? So SMART goals. Do you have clear goals? Practical considerations. Have you thought about all the issues that could emerge? Procedures. Well, what kind of interventions are you going to use? Well, the kind of group you do is going to impact the kind of interventions you use, right? And next class, we're going to talk about different models of therapy. Your theoretical orientation could affect the kind of interventions you use. Last but not least, evaluation. You want to think about how you're going to evaluate the process and the outcomes of the group. So when screening, right, you want to develop a series of questions, right, to reflect. So you want to ask yourself, should this person be included in this group at this time with this leader? Interesting. You want to look at that person, how they're going to relate to all the other members of the group, their level of self-awareness at this time, and you, how they're going to mesh with you. So that is an important question. Other questions include, well, what methods are you going to use for screening? How do you decide who's going to benefit and who might not fit in your group? You should come in a priori beforehand, thinking about this and have an answer. And how are you going to deal with a candidate that you don't include in your group? And there are many ways to deal with that, such as taking them on as individual therapy, referring them to another group, referring them to another clinician for individual therapy. So we talked about the purposes of the therapist intervention, but some of the things we may not have said, so let's go into it again. My job as a therapist is to challenge irrational thoughts, right? That's called cognitive restructure. Empowering participants, offering support, reinforcing helpful contributions from other members, encouraging you to take risks in an ethical way, providing stripes, to stop unproductive grape sessions, to reflect on incongruence. So for example, Sometimes when you ask people how are you feeling today, they say I feel good, but their description of mood is inconsistent with their face. Their affect looks depressed. So you might say, your words are saying me one thing, but your face is saying another. Right? That's challenging or confronting inconsistencies where you say, well, how are you really feeling? That gives opportunity to say on a deeper level that I'm not doing okay if they're not. You also have the role of bringing closure to a topic or a session as a leader. So we provide emotional simulation. I'm not going to read them all. We provide caring. We help with meaning attribution. We help with executive functioning. And here are a list of many different ways we do it. So the next decision you want to make is whether you want to lead the group by yourself or whether you want to have a co-facilitator or a co-therapist. There are benefits and drawbacks with co-therapists. One benefit is that you have more expertise in the room. Two providers, you're bringing more years of intervention into the treatment room. So if I have 10 years of experience and someone else has 5 years, collectively we have 15 years of experience. You have greater division of labor. So one person could focus on the content where the other person's focusing on the process. You could have group members receiving more individualized attention, right? You could have greater mediation skills to address conflict resolution, and so forth. Some drawbacks of co-facilitating is if the group leaders don't get along, it actually could be detrimental. You also might have competition among the co-facilitators, or they might have different levels of competency or skills, which could get in each other's way. They could build coalitions for one leader versus another. Or if both group leaders are on the same page and they're targeting one member of the group, that individual might feel ganged up upon or piled on. So it's important to think about the dangers as well. And with that, I'm going to stop. And that is sort of like a very fast rundown of group therapy. It's a both what you're doing in terms of process and function. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to also stop the lecture, and we'll continue next week. Take care, everybody.
All right, so that is your update for everybody, and I do want to get some of this stuff that we have going on moving quickly. And let me see if I know we have a bit of a holiday, so and I know this because one of my neighbors growing up, so the neighbor in my neighborhood was the founder of the Juneteenth celebration in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it started just with in Pleasant Ridge and Kenny Heights, and she has expanded to way bigger than that, which is amazing. And it's my birthday. So when I was a little kid, I had no idea what's going on. I thought there was a big old pig roast for my birthday, and I was wrong. So anyway, see you all Tuesday after the federal holiday. Have a good one. Dude, what's going on, man? No, I get it. Yeah, I know. You were already saying that too.
The author, D.
And she's still